Please listen carefully.
Okay, so first of all, I apologize in advance if I start sneezing or coughing. I somehow became a little bit ill in my travels, but it's really wonderful to be here today nonetheless, and it was especially exciting and kind of nerve-wracking to go after Clark Whittington. Those Artomatics, I've seen them all over the place, and I've always really loved them, and I wish I could say that I got married with a ring from an Artomatic, because that's awesome. My presentation today is about the power of story. And I think we know that Roanoke gets it, because today I've already heard a couple really incredible stories. And what I heard yesterday as well really showed to me that this community understands how important narrative is to connecting us to one another and to the place where we live. So, I'm a journalist. That's my background. Right now, I'm the editor-in-chief of Next City. If you don't know Next City, we're a website. We're a nonprofit organization with a mission to inspire change through journalism and events. You can find us at nextcity.org, and we publish reporting every day about what cities are doing to make themselves better places to be, more equitable, more inclusive, more sustainable, more resilient, and just generally more fun. We report on things like the projects that you guys are leading, the projects that you guys are part of. We report hopefully very human-centered stories about what makes cities keep on going. We don't shy away from the challenges. We often report on issues of poverty, issues of marginalization or disempowerment, but we try to take a solutions-oriented approach to look at ways to solve social problems, environmental problems, and economic problems. Yesterday, someone from the Participatory Budgeting program spoke. We've written a lot about participatory budgeting. For those of you who aren't here, it's a policy tool to bring voters into the process of budgeting, so voters can actually decide, residents of a community can decide how that $10,000 going to a city councilman is spent. They can say, oh, we want more public art in our neighborhood, or actually we want to really support new basketball courts in our parks, things like that. But that's a sort of engagement that we like to write about, among other things. Here's just a snapshot of some of our recent headlines. That top story was about a businessman in Honolulu who saw a problem, homelessness, and then recognized that there was a huge vacant area in a wetlands area in Honolulu that could be converted into a place for homeless individuals to find homes and work in a laundry facility nearby. So it's kind of an experiment in public-private collaboration to bring people out of homelessness. Down below that bottom story is one of my favorite recent features about the YIMBY movement. I don't know if you guys have heard of YIMBY. It's the opposite of NIMBY, so not in my backyard, but yes in my backyard. And this particular story focused on activists in Austin, Texas, who are working. Austin, as you guys might have heard, certainly Bob, who spoke earlier from Texas, is well aware that there's just a huge affordable housing crisis happening, and that there's a real need to develop more affordable housing. And there's a lot of resistance within communities of low-rise housing. People are very used to a less dense living environment, but people need places to live, so there is a movement to build more in that city. And that story was looking at how that group is slowly growing political capital and beginning to run their own candidates in local elections. So what we do is try to share ideas and stories to inspire change in community. This is a comment made from a woman named Tamaya Denard, who's running for city council in Cincinnati. This was a response to a recent survey. Next City gives me ideas from other parts of the world and expands on what I think is possible. I'm currently running for office, and so I get a lot of ideas from the stories. Now, ideas are really important. I Googled the city of Cincinnati, did a Google News search. I don't know if you guys have ever done that. These are the stories that came up. These are the stories that are being told about Cincinnati. Quick snapshot. Smoothie King is coming. There is a split between Bengals fans. There's some technology around shooting in the city. That's the news that's coming out of Cincinnati and is rising to the top of Google. So if I'm someone who is thinking, okay, well, maybe I want to move to Cincinnati, maybe I want to move to the neighborhood where Tamaya Denard is living, I Google that, and that's what I come up with as the story of this city. No, there's like something wrong there. And that's in part why we think at Next City, and why I'm here today to talk about the power of storytelling, that it's really, really important that communities take control of their own narrative and make sure that they're disseminating stories about the amazing work that we know is happening within communities. So I'm from Philadelphia. This is what happens when you Google Philadelphia. Top headline, Philadelphia, largest distressed city in the US. Not how I would describe my city, but okay, true. On some indicators, true. Kathleen Turner, there's a New York comic that's coming to town. These aren't the representative stories of the everyday life of the people that are working to make their cities better, and they're not even the representative stories of just what's happening on the ground, from new businesses opening to schools experimenting with different strategies for teaching kids, to parks expanding. There's so many things that are happening, but the way news has functioned for so long is we focus on points of crisis, and we focus on the dog bites man story, and sometimes that's not actually the most meaningful story. So here's Roanoke. This is what happened when I Googled Roanoke last week. Roanoke Council is going to meet. There's a study flood of blood donors in Roanoke. Maybe someone from Roanoke, we have a microphone somewhere out there, would be happy to stand up and tell me what are the stories that are coming from Roanoke that should have been on that list? What are the stories that you would want someone to see about your city if they were to search for Roanoke? Anyone? What was that? Best mid-sized mountain town, okay. CityWorks, okay, right. And what is the story of CityWorks?
Hundreds of people gathering for innovative ideas for community building.
Right, hundreds of people gathering for innovative ideas about community building. Hundreds of people in your community are coming together to talk about how to improve it. That's a great story. It's not up there. Anyone else?
Big Brothers Big Sisters is starting their matchup program this Saturday, matching students from an elementary school in a low-income neighborhood and matching them with Big Sisters. It's being funded in part by Trillion to promote health and wellness with school kids.
Great. So there's so many stories even within that one story. So you have the active civic group, Big Brothers Big Sisters. You have an anchor institution, this Carillion Hospital, that's working with the community. You have people that are forming new kinds of organizations to support one another. There's so much that's happening. None of that is heard here. So in 1961, Arthur Miller said, "A good newspaper is a nation talking to itself." Times have changed since 1961, obviously. If that was true, it certainly isn't true today for most communities. In 2013, a tech, PR sort of man said, "The future does not fit into the containers of the past." That, again, very, very true. We know that media is changing. The way we learn about one another, the way we connect to one another is changing every day. There are algorithms that are determining what I know about you, about Roanoke, about Philadelphia. There's just a lot of change that's happening very, very fast. That much of it is out of our control, actually. But there are ways to take control, and on a local level for cities to take control. So Lydia Polgreen is one of my favorite journalists. She's a New York Times reporter and editor. She recently moved to Huffington Post. And in an interview describing what her vision was for the new Huffington Post, this is what she said. For us, what we're trying to do is find the right balance of creating a space for emotion that leads to a sense of empathy and solidarity rather than a sense of division. In my most grandiose moments, I think of HuffPost as a platform that makes solidarity possible, that really thinking about the emotional content of stories is a way to help people who think or have been manipulated to think that their interests are opposed to one another, that they actually are aligned in a fundamental way. They're actually in the same boat. Empathy. To me, that's the core of community narrative and the power of journalism and of storytelling. Stories help us empathize with one another. And in a city, especially cities that, like Roanoke, are going through change, transition, growth, it's really important to be able to see eye to eye and empathize across difference. So, again, the power of story. Here are two photos of the city of Detroit. One is a boarded up home in a neighborhood that was once a pretty vibrant place. Now it's struggled with a lot of disinvestment. There's an empty factory. Once thousands of people worked there, now no one. This is Detroit too. Don't know what happened to that slide here, but this was a really beautiful photograph of young women marching, after a dance competition through downtown Detroit. They're representing their neighborhood and their school and showing pride in their community. That's not the story that you usually see of Detroit. That wasn't found from a Google search or a news magazine. That was found on the website of a local design group in Detroit. Detroit, to me, is a city that represents the power of narrative. You know, Detroit a few years back went through bankruptcy. Every headline was about Detroit in crisis, Detroit bankrupt, Detroit dead, essentially. All the images were negative. But in that moment of crisis, the city recognized itself and began to come together and began to realize that it needed to come up with a different way of, as Bob Cowell mentioned before, telling itself about itself. It decided that it needed to invent a new story about itself if it were going to survive. So Detroit did. Its new mayor, Mayor Dugan, created a new position, the city's chief storyteller. Now it's a $58,000 a year position, first of its kind in the nation, where they have a guy, Aaron Foley. He's a great guy. He was a journalist. I've actually worked with him on stories. He's written a book about Detroit. His job is to talk to the people of Detroit and find their stories and then disseminate these stories out to the world. Detroit is a very diverse city of more than 200 neighborhoods, and a lot of the coverage is focused on just a handful. There's a lot more to Detroit than bankruptcy. He was saying, forget those first two pictures. Everyone knows that. Let's talk about the third picture. Let's find many, many more pictures like that and show them to the world. Now, this isn't spin. This is finding what exists in community and letting it shine and letting it be public. He didn't invent this. He didn't take something that was sort of subpar and turn it around to make it look better for the mayor. He just took what people are doing in their community and elevated it on a platform. So this story is an article about a neighborhood group in a neighborhood in Detroit that most people just think of as sort of a blighted, poor neighborhood. But it's a community where people thrive, persevere, grow their own food. New businesses in a section of Detroit that most people, again, think of as an abandoned section of the city. So it's finding these stories and elevating them out that is so essential for, I think, cities to capitalize on the assets that their residents are already building. So what happens when I type Detroit into a Google News search? These headlines are actually more positive than the headlines that came up for Philadelphia or Roanoke. You know, there's more to Detroit than urban blight. Grant makers convene on entrepreneurship in Detroit. Iconic Detroit fence makes endorsement in mayor's race. The local media has gotten the message. They've said, okay, the story of our city isn't the story of decline, it's the story of resurgence. And they're finding those stories and telling it. They're following the cues of the community that made those stories visible. So I want to stop for a minute and ask all of you, not all of you are from Roanoke, if you can just share a narrative from your city that you think either is being shared and that's great, or isn't being shared and should be. Anyone? And just say where you're from.
I live in southeast Roanoke.
Uh-huh.
And we're a community that is recovering from what was, for some reason, we were given a bad reputation as a bad place to be. But I've lived there for 15 years now. I know we have caring people there. We're trying to change the narrative of our community. We're one, the closest communities to the market area of downtown, which is a happening place. We've gotten 2 community murals done there recently. We're working on a 3rd one. We're definitely changing the narrative of our community, making it a place to be.
Thank you. Anyone else? Hi.
Hi, I'm from the Detroit area.
Uh-huh.
I worked on 8 Mile for a very long time.
Okay.
And I can tell you that when I started, it was a place that you didn't want to keep your doors unlocked, even when you're driving. But by the time I left, it was much more of a sense of family and community than any negative that you've ever seen.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I guess I just want to say, one tension that I have, as a journalist, we are trained and to think of, is this even news? That positive things are happening in a community, that kind of thing, and what are you missing by focusing on that rather than investigating, why the schools aren't better or what kind of corruption led to a street not being fixed as well as it should have been, or all the other manifest things that happen in local government. But I think that both are really, really important, and I think that telling these positive stories is so important, especially now because we are in a moment of increased alienation, and where we do live so much of our lives on the internet. And it's really important to think about what people are doing in real life together, and to just understand that all of us do have the power to make a difference in our communities. So, I think it's very important to weigh out those 2 things and always understand that we're not, when we talk about solutions-oriented journalism, or when I'm talking about the power of positive community storytelling, it's not about spinning or avoiding the hard things that are happening in your cities. It's about also giving voice to the good things that are happening. And what's that?
Yeah, and I would just say, to your point, I'm from Danville, Virginia, and it's a pretty devastated economically, or historically has been, since textiles left. But I would say that it's not necessarily spin and it's not boosterism, but that devastation, economic devastation, is actually a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of empty buildings that can be redone, rehabbed, and there's just a lot of opportunity there. And I think to have more articles about that space for impact would be better than to just focus on the negative economic depression.
Right.
I'm from Lexington, Virginia.
Oh.
We have obviously deep roots in the Civil War, and so right now we're trying to kind of rewrite our future in regards to the Confederacy, and trying to understand what is the future narrative we want about our city and town.
That's actually a really important point. So my final slide is actually Philadelphia City Hall, very close to my office actually, and a new monument that was just put up. It's by an artist named Hank Willis Thomas. It's a Black Power hair comb. And it's part of a project called Monument Lab. And it was a 2-year effort funded by philanthropy and the city to think about what new monuments the city of Philadelphia wanted to erect, to think about its vision for its future. There's plenty of monuments of like men on horses, Revolutionary War heroes, various other figures from our past, but what does our future look like, and how can it include all of us? And so I think, to your point and to this point, as a nation, we're thinking a lot about what is our vision forward. And to do that, we need to elevate these stories, and we need to be able to talk to one another and recognize one another, to be able to build monuments like that I can see myself in and you can see yourself in, and Hank Willis Thomas can see himself in. So thank you very, very much, and please check out nextcity.org.